Okay, we're ready to begin. Thanks for your patience. I'm Laura Stefani, partner in Venable's communication group. It's my pleasure to bring you part 2 of our 2-part program on radio receiver regulation, or the possibility of regulation. Last week's conversation looked at what could go right, and this session is going to look a little bit at what could go wrong. And for those of you who missed the first session, as I just mentioned, that was recorded and that will be up on our website and our YouTube channel, hopefully later this week. We set up the series because of a notice of inquiry that has been put out by the Federal Communications Commission that's looking to gather information on receiver performance with the aim of promoting more efficient spectrum use and spectrum management by encouraging improved receiver interference immunity. So our goal is to give you some guidance, help you determine whether you want to file in the proceeding. The comments are due this coming Monday, June 27th. So thanks so much for my 2 guests for joining me today. We have David Case, who is a longtime wireless industry engineer who participates in the C63 Standard Setting Committee and consults on US and Canadian regulatory approvals for new devices. He has more than 40 years of experience in EMC and RF exposure compliance, has worked for HealthKit Electronics, Zenith Data Systems, Telexon, Aeronet Wireless Communications, and Cisco Systems before starting his own consulting group. And Andy Clegg, who is a spectrum engineer lead for Google, and he focuses on identifying spectrum sharing opportunities for wireless broadband networks, primarily in the context of multi-tier spectrum sharing. He was integral in the adoption and implementation of the Citizens Broadband Radio Service, is very involved in the Wireless Innovation Forum, as well as the FCC's TAC, and has previous experience in government at the National Science Foundation. So thank you so much for joining me. Let me start with a similar question that I posed last week. If the FCC's goal is to improve spectrum management and to facilitate new opportunities for spectrum resources within the United States, to what extent will improvements in receiver design facilitate this goal? Can more efficient receivers achieve interference immunity? Can spectrum use efficiencies be gained by this, and what other opportunities might be achieved here?
I'll take a quick first stab. It's a great question, and I think we really have to look at this. It's a matter of balance, right? So we could generally build receivers that are almost, brick wall filters and immune to all sorts of interference and things. But then, we wouldn't want to have to pay $1,000 for our garage door opener or our key fobs or, whatever other device that is designed to be a cheap and inexpensive consumer device. On the other hand, there are some type of devices that maybe that is appropriate for, critical devices like GPS receivers for high accuracy farming or for surveying. Those are sort of enterprise or very expensive devices that are designed to function in a range of environments, or radio altimeters on airplanes for that matter. So I think it's just a balance. You've got to look at the rewards and the costs involved in improving receiver design, and I think you have to match that to the economic realities and the consumer expectations and safety of life in some cases.
Andy, I would agree with that. The one thing you need to think about, though, when you're looking at the cost of receivers, is that part of the thing is to make sure that you get to work with in the band you're working with. So it depends on your transmitter. You harden your receiver too much in one end, you could lose range. You could lose, some low signals and stuff. So you're gonna have to increase power in some cases to make the connection maybe over X amount of distance. So I mean, that's something to be concerned about, as well as it's not a one size fits all. It's going to be, for whatever services, is going to have to go based on what their needs are to make your service work correctly.
So that's an interesting trade-off you mentioned, Dave. If you need to increase power, then what does that mean for spectrum sharing in band, especially if the purpose is to improve the sharing environment for the adjacent channels where the commission may want to open those up to additional uses. Well, one path that the FCC is looking at is encouraging industry-led voluntary standards, and I think you both have been involved in various standard setting groups. How likely is this idea of using industry and voluntary standards going to achieve new or different results? You know, the results that the FCC seems to be looking at here, which is to find efficiencies in spectrum management.
I'll take a shot at that one if you don't mind. Part of the thing is it's a good, on one hand, obviously the standards organizations, so 802.11, 3GPP, others are working on, if they have their standards, they do have some receiver qualifications in there. The issue being, though, is that if you specify in the standard that you must be, comply with 3GPP or, 802.11ax or whatever, you've kind of pigeonholed that spectrum to a very specific use. And in other words, you have to either use that standard device to operate a standard. So you take away from devices using, what other technology, which is non-standardized.
You'd reduce flexibility.
Right.
I also think, I'm a proponent of allowing industry to work out its own receiver standards. It's done a good job of that in terms of 802.11 devices or 4G LTE devices and 5G NR devices. It's done a pretty good job of mandating or recommending certain voluntary minimum standards of performance and certifying to those standards. So I'm a big proponent of allowing that. But there are at times regulatory decisions that are made to which no voluntary industry standard could ever really thoroughly help. So, for example, a regulatory decision was made to authorize the 3.45 gigahertz service in 3450 to 3550 immediately below the CBRS band in 3550 to 3700. There is no guard band between the two, and the 3450 to 3550 megahertz service can use up to 3,000 watts per megahertz, where CBRS is limited to 5 watts per megahertz. So you have this very big power imbalance. And even if you had an almost perfect receive filter, you can't instantaneously kick in and reject that much power in the immediately adjacent band. But even beyond that, we have our ESC sensors that are designed to detect government radar activity at 3550 to 3650 megahertz. And if you put one 3.45 gigahertz service, high-powered base station in the vicinity of an ESC sensor, again, there's no guard band, and we'll never be able to detect the government radar out in the ocean. And the FCC recognized that as a potential issue and said a few words about it in the order, but really there's no solid way of addressing that. And a receiver standard, there's no help there because, again, there's no guard band between the two.
Yeah. Right. Well, one question I have, and I don't know if you can answer this, Dave, is, in terms of encouraging industry-led voluntary standards, do most of the standard setting organizations already consider an integrated systems approach when it comes to design or requirements? And if so, is that already happening? Is it sufficient as it is?
It's happening. The real question comes down to you're looking at, and the people I've talked to developing receivers and stuff is, again, you're looking whether it's a satellite receiver, whether it's a GPS or whatever. They're looking at that, but the concern, it's got to be a voluntary. The concern is if you go to put regulatory thing, you have a very specific thing. And I'm thinking back in Ed, you might remember that was it the light year or whatever that one thing, the thing that they wanted to use the GPS bands. It was concerned those receivers just wide open at the time. But they said marrying the receivers up, the GPS receivers they would lose their accuracy and stuff. So, I mean, you've got to look at, so the technology's there to do some of the things, is how you approach it. And I think it's got to be some of an industrial thing. I mean, I think it's C63.27, which is the coexistence standard we've been working on, talking about how do we do testing for that. But I can test with commercial systems, I can't test with some of the government systems to see I'm going to cause a problem or they're going to cause a problem with me, because some of the stuff's classified. We don't have the information. Like when we did the DFS, we didn't have that. We had the generic radar bands to work, signals to work with.
Good point. Good point. Right. Well, in terms of receiver filters, I think we touched on that. Do either of you have a sense of, well, let me ask this question first. Are better filters, better in quotes, always more costly? And what are there design implications and trade-offs in requiring that?
It depends on what you mean by better, right? So there are cases where a receiver is built with the current spectrum environment in mind. And so it may have a decent filter, but that filter may cross areas that aren't, assigned to that particular service, because at that time, that portion of spectrum that the receiver includes did not have any problematic system in it. So it's like the light squared or legato case that Dave was just talking about, because they extended those filters out wider to get the wide area augmentation system that was down farther in frequency. But as soon as you start filling in that middle part with higher power terrestrial systems, you have a problem. So it's not that the filters were not good, it's just that they were designed at a time when the spectrum environment was different. But if you're talking about just a generic filter, can you make it tighter? Can you make it fall off faster? Yes, but as Dave, indicated earlier on, that tends to increase the amount of attenuation in the band that you desire. So it's always a trade-off among performance and cost and things like that. So it's a multi-dimensional trade-off. And if I could just answer one of the questions that was sent in that asked, how do you regulate receiver performance for high-end devices, not for cheaper, low-cost devices? It's a really good question. One point I would like to make, and this is not the totality of points to make, is that the cheaper, low-cost devices tend to turn over faster. So if better filters are needed for those because the spectrum environment changes, that can be implemented as just a course of the normal turnover of the low-cost device. The higher expense devices like surveying equipment, the example I gave earlier, that tends to be bought and held onto for a long time, and there's less turnover. So I think there's a justification for requiring receiver standards for some of these longer lasting types of receivers than there are for the cheaper ones that turn over more quickly.
Andy, continuing that thing too, thinking about one thing you mentioned is, you design your receiver, you've got the filter for your device, and because you're doing it to figure out what's the other bands next to you to protect yourself. But then they change the band gets designated as a new technology, and your receiver in your filter for some reason cannot address that, or it's just, it's not generic enough because it's, the narrow band can get through or something. So I think that's going to be the thing, is it's only good for that thing as things change, bands usage, frequency usage, systems can become obsolete, those filtering systems could be obsolete, or if you try to move into a new band, you can't tune your older devices down there because you get a hard stop at whatever the bandage is.
Well, to some extent, I think a lot of the cheaper, low-cost devices might be Part 15 unlicensed devices, and you could argue, I think, that those are, in some ways, maybe receiver regulation wouldn't make as much sense for those because they're already required to be designed to provide, interference immunity to the allocated services.
Well, true. I think the higher end systems, though, depending what the mission is, for things, public safety or something else, it's going to have some, obviously somewhat ruggedized in the sense, hopefully, because if it's used for critical life thing, hopefully it's got some additional stuff in there. You're putting so the high end stuff is probably in some cases taken care of, except when you walk in with your I recall issues that when we were doing some work at AT&T, walked in with some Wi-Fi stuff. They were having issues there with interference with some of their stuff because it wasn't designed to be allowed the Wi-Fi devices into their central networking rooms.
I mean, we've kind of already touched on this question, but are there services and technologies and other situations where receiver performance requirements or interference immunity performance measures would not be appropriate. The NOI specifically asks about public safety users. For me, perhaps radar comes to mind just because of how those are required to operate. Should there be different approaches depending on the service or the frequency or the functionality? And should any of this be carved out in a policy statement if that's what FCC chooses to do?
So in my opinion, there are services, clearly some services where receiver performance standards could be very difficult to implement. I'm thinking specifically of passive services that have highly sensitive receivers like radio astronomy or Earth exploration satellite service. And the reason is that, they're looking for thermal emissions that are down at the fractions of Kelvin level. And if you insert a filter in front of those with even the tiniest bit of insertion loss in that filter, that completely swamps the thermal noise coming from that filter, completely swamps the signature of the signals they're trying to detect. So you cannot easily implement filtering in a radio astronomy or passive satellite system. So that, I think, is one obvious example where receiver immunity performance standards might be a little difficult to implement.
I agree. I certainly see that. Dave, did you have anything to add?
I'm thinking, I'm just looking at the next question that come in. I was thinking about that, but it does there, you're right, Andy, on that. The point of view is that there are services and stuff, cost trade-offs and stuff to do think about on this, some of these items. And I'm looking from the engineering side. You're looking at the spectrum. I'm looking at the LSC allocation rules. They did spectrum. We do sharing studies. That was ITU or the FCC stuff, and those are all based on theory. It doesn't really help until you get to the lab and work on them and actually see the real world interference issues. And then you have to develop. You're going to end up developing your filters from there, I'm thinking. So I'm thinking the same cost, the same would be used no matter how you address it. For what bands, you're going to have an issue where you can't, the government's like, right, the radar systems, we can't do anything because those systems have got to be sensitive. They got to be able to track the planes coming in or, whatever. I mean, it's so that you just, some system filtering on them would basically ruin the mission. Like you said, make it mission critical thing would not be completed.
It sounds like if an FCC policy statement comes out of this, then it probably is going to have to be something that carves out what it would apply to and what it would not need to apply to. And I think that might be something that commission's going to have to think through and perhaps struggle with a little bit.
Well, they won't be able to dictate to the government, I mean, DOD side and other stuff, because those are very specific missions. So, and that's some of the bands which we're starting to share now. That's the issue. I mean, that's what we had DFS developed for and stuff. That's, we're looking at this, to avoid these systems because we know we can't, our systems would swamp their radars if we, because receivers.
The NOI makes general inquiries about the measurement of receiver performance. Are there good techniques and measurement devices available to do this right now? And is it band or technology specific?
I would say that yes, we have the equipment to measure receiver performance standards quite well right now. And there, it's often done in some fields that they measure receiver performance. And, we have everything to test, nonlinear responses, out of band responses, all sorts of things. Now, whether, we don't have labs that play every kind of adjacent channel interfering signal into every kind of device, but that's a bit of overkill. I don't think we really need that, but we do have plenty of equipment that's capable of measuring the basic receiver performance requirements.
That's right. Again, I had talked about CC3.27. We were looking at the interference levels for coexistence, and it's mostly for wireless devices being put in medical devices. Mm-hmm. And we are looking at this receiver noise there, how much before your system stops functioning. for sending critical information across, obviously medical network, your heart monitor or whatever. So I think those, so the labs are set to do that. The thing is the cost and the additional time spent. And the availability, because with the understanding is, well, my receiver is great now, it passes, doesn't mean you won't have interference. And that's what people are still thinking. All these specifications will help mitigate some of it, but will not eliminate it. And that's what people need to understand. People think, well, I've got the new receiver spec. I go out to, no, it's not going to, it will help you, but it will not solve your issue overall, because you'll still have issues where you're going to get interference.
There's no perfectly quiet noise floor everywhere, right?
Right.
Yeah.
Right.
So we have a question/comment that came in about receiver standards. It says it seems to be a general benefit for society and the consumer, but the observation is that legacy systems and the economic cost to implement this for new systems might make voluntary option, I think they mean voluntary standards, untenable. So a government mandate, meaning regulatory action, seems like it could address the issue in the interest of the nation and the FCC's interests, I guess, of promoting spectrum efficiencies. Does anyone want to address or comment on this?
Trying to think of questions. Okay. The legacy systems are going to be with you always. No matter what it is, whether it's receivers, whether it's cars, whatever, you're going to have the legacy systems there, and you won't be able to adapt some of them. They simply won't adapt, and because it's too costly to adapt. So you're going to say, well, you can no longer. I know somebody used a 2G phone until they finally turned the service off. We never changed it. You're always going to have that one issue. So legacy systems could be there. How to adapt them, or should they be phased out? It's something that's going to be determined. But again, I think it's a little overreach from that point of view.
Yeah, it's the idea of a government mandate on receiver performance is, I don't know. I still think that's a little heavy-handed, and I think industry standards and also consumer expectations should be relied upon more than a heavy-handed approach from the government, in my opinion. If we find going forward that this is just a constant problem, remember we've had two high-profile issues, with Legato and with the radio altimeters. But I think it's a little heavy-handed to declare at this time that government regulation is required. And by the way, Mark Gibson had asked earlier in the question, basically saying that the NOI addresses non-federal government receiver standards, and in the case of the radio altimeter thing, you can argue that the radio altimeters are considered federal government systems or on FAA certified aircraft. I guess that makes them a federal government system. I honestly don't know the answer to that. But I think it's pretty clear that the FCC and the NTIA and their new spirit of cooperation really do need to look at these receiver standard questions together.
And that's one thing we talked about at the last session, is that clearly there's some plan here for the FCC to put out this NOI and put out all the commissioner statements regarding it as a way of kind of giving some kind of notice to industry and all designers and all users that they need to start thinking about these issues and be a little more thoughtful in their receiver design, because the FCC does plan to fill up whatever unused spectrum that it can find and can get access to that it's not already being used, especially like mid-band spectrum where that is so needed and so popular right now. I think that's clear.
The issue is, though, that people realize in receiver standards is when you're putting a receiver standard out, I'm making whatever device you're making. I just got to worry about protecting my device. The real issue is the people you're sharing the bandwidth, and that means, okay, if I'm sharing it with like the radio altimeters or whoever, or like a 4G service or whatever, they're the ones. They've got the receivers. They got to be protected, because if I'm not worried about the issue in my end, they're the ones that got to do it. So they remember asking for this, something that's going to come back, could back to them, says they're the ones that need to fix their receiver.
Well, certainly, I think some of the questions about harms claim thresholds and performance mandates, those would be kind of the most prescriptive policy changes or rules that could come out of this. But the NOI does ask about a number of other topics. So one is kind of creating a sharing clearinghouse for the sharing of receiver design information, which I guess would serve to just give notice about what's happening in adjacent bands and allow others to design it and develop policy around that. Do either of you have any comments about that?
My experience with that so far is that the receiver manufacturers tend to hold that as proprietary information. When we were dealing, so there was an industry group that's set up to deal with coexistence between CBRS and the upper adjacent 3.7 gigahertz service. And you really can't do the calculation until you have actual numbers for the receiver performance, the filter performance of the base stations operating in the bands. And that information was considered proprietary from the manufacturers, and we never did get that information. So I'm not sure how much information you get contributed to a receiver performance clearinghouse because of that.
Right, because the standard may have a minimum minus whatever, right, and then the manufacturer may be able to tune it better, but they may not want their competitors to know, hey, I could go to minus 86 to minus 75 and stuff in spec, because it's a little selling point to their customers where our receivers are better than company X's.
I mean, I think the idea is that they would somehow do this in a way where the information could be protected, but it sounds like there would have to be a lot of thought about how that could be done before industry would really be comfortable participating in something like that.
We go back to DFS discussion we were talking to things. A lot of people are really reluctant to provide that information because you're trying to share the band. Partly too, if you're moving into a band, you don't want to give that information away. If you want to protect your band, you don't want the new incumbent, you don't want the new source in there. I'm not going to tell you my receiver specs because I'm going to give you a number. Here's what you got to meet for protecting me, and that's it.
Right. Exactly.
But one thing I think that the commission needs to recognize from a regulatory perspective, if you set immediately adjacent bands with no guard band between the two, there's very limited amount you can do with receiver standards. If you have zero bandwidth or zero guard band between two systems, there's only a very limited amount you can do with receiver standards.
Doesn't it depend on the technology though, and how sharply it falls off?
Right, but nothing ever falls off in 0 megahertz.
Yeah, it doesn't just drop off to zero at the band as much as we love to.
I understand. Well, we're coming up at the end of our half hour already. Let me ask you both as a closing question, if you want to address what are your expectations of what this proceeding will achieve and where it most likely go?
I'll say quickly, I don't want to be cynical, but the NOI to me, makes your head spin when you read it. There's so many question marks, and you feel like, well, where do you start? And I think the commission should seriously think about taking one small step first, rather than addressing every single question that they've asked in there, because I think you won't make a whole lot of headway if you try to do everything that's in that NOI right now.
It would certainly take a lot of staff time, that's for sure.
Yeah.
And I recall the same discussion, even though not a rulemaking, has been going for years. Anytime he's been in commission, he's talked to them on issues. There's always been concern of what can you do about the receiver side. And I know because Europe's got some stuff, receiver rejection rate stuff. I still think this is going to take a lot of thought, because it's going to be, you can't do it all. It's not for, it's going to be band by band approach for device by device, because it's cost wise and stuff. So it's not a one size fits all. I really, maybe if you get anything, maybe gets industry thinking about they need to do something before the government steps in and does something that they're not going to be able to like.
I certainly think that's probably part of the purpose of this, for sure.
Yep.
Well, thank you again for your participation today. I really enjoyed our conversation.
Thanks, Laura.
And thank you for our attendees for joining us. As I mentioned, the 2 videos will be up on our YouTube channel in the next week or so.
Thanks.
Thanks.
Bye, everybody.
Bye.